Between October 23rd and 24th, 1983, 10 people were eliminated across the remote hollows of Breathitt County, Kentucky, in what would become known as the Sacred Oak Massacre. All adults, all connected to a single logging operation. The method was surgical rifle shots from distance, ambushes on mountain roads, executions in dense forest where screams disappeared into morning fog. The perpetrators weren't environmental extremists or anti-government militias. They were 3 members of the Garrett family, a father and his 2 sons, moving through the mountains like ghosts, methodically eliminating everyone who'd raised a chainsaw against what they held most sacred. The FBI would later call it one of the most ideologically driven mass killings in Appalachian history. But the motive wasn't terrorism, wasn't a land dispute over money, wasn't even revenge for personal violence. It was a tree, a 347-year-old white oak, that had witnessed 7 generations of Garrett births, deaths, and promises cut down by men who saw only board feet and profit margins. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Breathitt County, Kentucky, sprawled across 495 square miles of some of the most isolated terrain in the eastern United States in 1983. The Cumberland Mountains rose like ancient walls, their peaks reaching over 3,000 feet, their valleys so narrow and steep that sunlight only touched the bottom for 3 hours each day during October. Population stood around 15,000, down from 28,000 in the boom years of the 1950s when coal was king. The county seat, Jackson, held barely 5,000 souls who knew each other's business, each other's secrets, and each other's grudges, going back generations. October in Breathitt County meant temperatures dropping to the low 40s at night, creeping up to maybe 62 by mid-afternoon, if you were lucky. The air smelled like wood smoke from coal stoves and fireplaces mixed with the sharp scent of fallen leaves decomposing on the forest floor, and underneath it all, the metallic tang of mountain streams running cold over limestone. At dawn, when fog rolled down from the ridges thick as cotton, you could hear the distant sound of chainsaws echoing across hollows, and the rumble of logging trucks grinding up impossible grades in low gear. Sound traveled strange in those mountains. Sometimes you'd hear a rifle shot 3 miles away, clear as a bell. Other times, you wouldn't hear a man standing 10 feet behind you until he spoke. But 1983 was a devastating year for what remained of rural Kentucky. The coal industry that had sustained these mountains for nearly a century was in its death throes. Mechanization had eliminated thousands of jobs. Mines that had employed hundreds now sat abandoned, their entrances sealed with concrete, their machinery rusting in the rain. Unemployment in Breathitt County hovered around 38% that fall. Men who'd spent their entire adult lives underground, breathing coal dust, risking black lung and cave-ins for union wages, now had nothing. No jobs, no prospects, no way to feed their families except disability checks that barely covered rent and food stamps that bought humiliation at the Jackson Piggly Wiggly. In that economic wasteland, timber became the new coal. The Reagan administration's deregulation policies had opened Appalachian forests to aggressive commercial logging. Companies from out of state descended on Kentucky like locusts. offering desperate landowners cash for timber rights. Not much cash, never enough, but more money than most families had seen in years. For men watching their children go hungry, watching their homes fall apart, watching their communities die. Selling timber rights felt less like choice and more like survival. The mountains provided everything the timber companies needed. Millions of acres of old-growth forest, dense stands of white oak, hickory, and poplar that had been growing since before the Civil War. Isolated locations where environmental regulations were theoretical at best. And a population so economically desperate they'd sign contracts they didn't fully understand just to keep the lights on another month. The logging operations weren't subtle. Massive trucks appeared on mountain roads never designed for such weight. Chainsaws screamed from dawn to dusk. Ancient trees that had stood for centuries came crashing down in seconds. The companies would clear-cut entire hillsides, leaving behind stumps and erosion and streams choked with sawdust. They'd promise replanting, promise sustainable harvesting, promise local jobs. The replanting never happened. The sustainability was a lie. The local jobs went to out-of-state crews who worked cheaper and asked fewer questions. By October of 1983, nearly 40% of Breathitt County's old-growth forest had been harvested. Entire mountains stripped bare, their timber shipped to lumber mills in Tennessee and North Carolina, turned into furniture and flooring for people who'd never seen the Cumberland Mountains, who'd never know what was destroyed to make their lives slightly more comfortable. But some families refused to sell. Not out of environmental consciousness, though that mattered too. They refused because their land, their trees, their mountains represented something money couldn't measure. Identity, history, connection to ancestors who'd walked these same ridges 200 years before. For families like the Garretts, the forest wasn't a commodity. It was a cathedral. Raymond Garrett was 54 years old that October, though he looked closer to 65. He stood 6'2", but stooped forward from 3 decades of tobacco farming. His spine curved from endless hours, bent over plants, in fields that never quite yielded enough. His hands were enormous, knuckles swollen with arthritis that flared up whenever rain was coming. Fingers stained yellow-brown from rolling his own cigarettes with Prince Albert tobacco. He bought in bulk from the general store in Jackson. A thick scar ran from his right eyebrow to his hairline, a souvenir from the Korean War, shrapnel from a mortar round that had missed killing him by 3 inches. He walked with a slight limp, legacy of the same explosion. And when the temperature dropped below 40 degrees, that limp became pronounced enough that his sons had to help him up the porch steps of the house his grandfather had built in 1923. Every morning, Raymond woke at 4:45, made coffee in a percolator so old the bottom was worn thin, and sat at his kitchen table reading from a King James Bible his mother had given him in 1951. He'd read 1 chapter, drink his coffee black and strong enough to strip paint, then step outside to watch the sun come up over Big Hill. He'd smoke 1 cigarette, unfiltered Lucky Strike, rolled so tight it lasted 20 minutes, and then he'd walk the half-mile to the White Oak. That walk was the center of his day. He'd married Sarah Louise Hendricks in 1952, right after his discharge from the Army. She was 19 then, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or fancy clothes, just clear eyes and strong hands, and a directness that made lying to her impossible. They'd had 2 sons, Michael, born in 1954, Jacob, born in 1956. Sarah was 51 now, her face lined from worry and sun, her hands as work-worn as Raymond's. But when she smiled, which wasn't often anymore, you could still see the 19-year-old girl who'd said yes when Raymond proposed on one knee beneath the white oak. What Raymond valued most wasn't money. He'd never had much anyway, scraping by on tobacco crops and vegetable gardens and the occasional odd job. What he valued wasn't even the land itself, though he loved every acre of the 240 acres his great-great-grandfather had claimed in 1840. What Raymond valued was continuity, the unbroken line connecting him to ancestors he'd never met, to descendants he'd never know. That white oak was the manifestation. His great-great-great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel Garrett, had planted it in 1636 after fleeing religious persecution in Massachusetts. 7 generations of Garrett men had been born within sight of that tree. 12 generations had carved their initials into its bark when they turned 18. Raymond's own initials, carved in 1947, sat 9 feet up. The oak wasn't just a tree. The white oak stood on the highest point of Garrett Land, a ridge that overlooked Frozen Creek Valley to the east and the junction of routes 476 and 15 to the west. At 127 feet tall, it towered over every other tree in the county. Its trunk measured 23 feet in circumference at chest height, so massive that 3 grown men holding hands couldn't encircle it. The lowest branches started 40 feet up, each branch as thick as a normal tree trunk, spreading outward in a canopy that covered nearly a quarter acre. In spring, the leaves came in so dense they blocked out the sun. In fall, they turned a gold so deep it looked like the tree was on fire. Ezekiel Garrett had planted the acorn in 1636, the same year he'd staked his claim to the land. Family records, passed down through generations, told the story in Ezekiel's own handwriting. He'd been a Puritan in Massachusetts, but not the right kind of Puritan. Too many questions, too much doubt, too much insistence that God spoke through nature as much as through Scripture. The elders had given him a choice: recant or leave. He'd chosen to leave, walking south for 8 months until he found mountains that reminded him of the highlands his ancestors had left in Scotland. He'd planted that acorn on the day his first son was born, a symbol of roots, of permanence, of a family tree that would grow alongside the oak. 7 generations had gathered beneath those branches for everything that mattered. Weddings, every single one. Raymond's grandparents married there in 1898. His parents in 1922. Raymond and Sarah in 1952. Funerals, too, when weather permitted. Ezekiel himself was buried 10 feet from the trunk, his grave marked by a limestone slab his son had carved. 63 Garretts rested in the ground within sight of that oak, their graves forming a semicircle that had grown over 3 centuries. Birth announcements delivered on the ridge. coming-of-age ceremonies when sons turned 18 and carved their initials, marriage proposals, deathbed confessions. Every major moment in Garrett family history had happened in the presence of that tree, as if the oak witnessed and remembered, as if it held in its rings the accumulated weight of all those lives. The ritual of carving initials had started with Ezekiel's son in 1673. Every Garrett male, on his 18th birthday, would climb to the 9-foot mark and carve his initials with whatever knife he carried. Some carvings were crude, just letters hacked into bark. Others were elaborate, surrounded by dates and symbols. The pattern formed a spiral up the trunk, 347 years of names, a family tree, made literal. Raymond could trace his ancestry by walking around the oak, reading names, doing the math. There was Ezekiel's son, Josiah. Josiah's sons, Matthew and Thomas. On and on, connecting past to present. When Raymond looked at that oak, he didn't see board feet. He saw ancestors. The oak was immortality, the closest thing to eternal life Raymond would ever touch. Michael Raymond Garrett was 29 years old that October. Though people who knew him said the war had aged him beyond his years. He stood 6'1", lean and ropey with muscle built from farm work, not gym time. His most distinctive feature was his eyes, pale blue and absolutely flat, the kind of eyes that looked through you rather than at you. That flatness had come back with him from Vietnam. Before the war, people said, Michael's eyes had been warm, expressive, full of the mischief you'd expect from a boy who grew up climbing mountains and swimming in creeks. After 13 months in the Central Highlands, after watching his platoon get shredded by an ambush outside Pleiku, after carrying his best friend's body 3 miles through jungle while under fire, those eyes had gone cold. He'd earned a Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds to his left shoulder and right leg. He'd earned a Bronze Star for valor, though he'd thrown the medal in a drawer and never looked at it again. What the medals didn't mention was the nightmares that still woke him 3-4 times a week, or the way sudden noises made him drop to the ground, or the fact that he couldn't hold a job for more than 6 months because authority figures made his hands shake. He lived in a small cabin 200 yards from the main house, worked the tobacco fields with his father, and spent his evenings sitting on his porch, cleaning his rifle, and drinking whiskey until sleep seemed possible. Jacob Thomas Garrett was 27, 2 years younger than Michael, but in some ways older. Where Michael was all sharp edges and barely controlled violence, Jacob was quiet, methodical, the kind of man who thought before he spoke and meant every word when he did speak. He stood 5'11", built stockier than his brother, with their father's broad shoulders and massive hands. He'd worked in the coal mines from age 18 to 24, mostly at the Riverbend mine over in Perry County, until the mine closed in 1980. Since then, he'd picked up odd jobs, carpentry work, engine repair, whatever paid enough to cover his share of household expenses. He lived in the main house with Raymond and Sarah, never married, never even came close. He'd had a girlfriend once, Melissa Combs, from over in Lost Creek, but she'd wanted to leave Kentucky, wanted to move to Lexington or Louisville, somewhere with jobs and future. Jacob had explained, quiet and final, that he couldn't leave. His family was here. The land was here. Everything that mattered was here. She'd left without him in 81. He hadn't dated since. What bound Michael and Jacob together wasn't just blood. It was a code their father had taught them since they were old enough to understand words. Family comes first, always. The land isn't property, it's identity. What was given to you by ancestors, you protect for descendants. Never let anyone take what's yours without consequences. Some things you protect with your life, if necessary. Both brothers had carved their initials in the oak. Both had stood on that ridge on their 18th birthdays and felt the weight of history, the presence of ancestors, the responsibility to the future. Both understood that they would die before they let anything happen to that tree. Consolidated Appalachian Timber Corporation, known as CATCO, arrived in Breathitt County in spring of 1982. The company operated out of Knoxville, Tennessee, owned by a conglomerate that also owned paper mills, furniture factories, and real estate development across the South. CATCO's business model was brutally efficient. Send land agents into economically devastated rural counties. Identify desperate families. Offer just enough money to seem like salvation. Get signatures on contracts, written in legal language. Most mountain people couldn't parse. Harvest everything. Move on. The agents who came that spring were professionals. They wore inexpensive suits, drove pickup trucks, spoke with just enough Kentucky accent to seem trustworthy. They'd done this in eastern Tennessee, in West Virginia, in western North Carolina. They knew how to read a community, how to find pressure points, how to turn economic desperation into legal documents that stripped families of heritage they'd held for generations. By summer of 1982, CATCO had secured timber rights to 17,000 acres in Breathitt County. The company paid an average of $8 per acre, a pittance compared to actual timber value, but a fortune to families who hadn't seen that much cash in years. Some families sold willingly, grateful for income. Others sold reluctantly, knowing they were being exploited but seeing no alternative. A few, like the Garretts, refused entirely. Raymond Garrett first heard about CATCO in June of 1982 at the Farmers Co-op in Jackson. Bobby Sizemore, who owned land 3 miles east of the Garrett property, had just signed a contract. $12,000 for timber rights on his 140 acres. Bobby was euphoric, talking about paying off medical bills from his wife's cancer treatment, about buying a used truck that ran. Raymond listened and said nothing. He understood Bobby's desperation. He didn't judge it. But when Bobby asked if Raymond was going to sell, Raymond's answer was simple and final. Never. The land wasn't his to sell. It belonged to his ancestors and descendants. He was just the caretaker for his generation. CATCO's land agent, a man named Dale Pritchard, showed up at the Garrett homestead in August of 1982. He was 41, originally from Harlan County, spoke with a thick eastern Kentucky accent that was probably genuine. He drove a Ford F-150 that looked work-worn but wasn't, wore Levi's and flannel, carried a briefcase that seemed out of place. He was good at his job. He didn't start with the sales pitch. He started with conversation. Asked about the tobacco crop, commented on weather, mentioned he'd served in Vietnam too, same years as Michael. Slowly worked his way to the offer. $175,000 for timber rights on the Garrett's 240 acres. More money than Raymond had ever imagined having. Raymond's answer was no. Not negotiation, not maybe, just no. Dale tried again 2 weeks later. Same offer, same answer. He tried a third time in October, raised the offer to $200,000. Raymond explained, patient but firm, that the number didn't matter. Some things couldn't be bought. Bobby Ray Collins was 41 years old in October of 1983, foreman of a Catco logging crew based out of Pineville in Bell County. He stood 5'10", built solid from years of physical labor, with a thick beard going gray and hands that looked carved from oak themselves. He'd been logging since he was 19, worked his way up from saw operator to foreman, supported a wife and 3 kids on wages that were decent by Eastern Kentucky standards, but barely middle class by national measures. His wife, Linda, was 39, worked part-time at a grocery store in Pineville. Their kids were 17, 14, and 11. Decent kids, stayed out of trouble, made okay grades. Bobby was trying to save enough to send the oldest to community college, trying to give his children options he'd never had. He wasn't a bad man. He worked hard, paid his bills, went to church on Sundays, coached his youngest son's little league team. But logging was what he knew, what he was good at. And in 1983, with unemployment devastating the region, you took available work and didn't ask too many questions about whose land you were cutting. The rest of Bobby's crew were similar men. Danny Higgins, 34, from Harlan, married with 2 kids. Roy Thompson, 29, from Cumberland, single, sending money home to his disabled mother. Marcus Webb, 46, from Corbin, divorced, paying child support for 4 kids. James Dale Porter, 31, from Whitley County, married with 1 kid and another coming. Carl Messer, 27, from Knox County, engaged to be married in December. Tyler Banks, 39, from Letcher County, widower raising 3 kids alone. Frank Morrison, 33, from Leslie County, married with twin daughters. Kevin Walsh, 26, from Perry County, married just 6 months. Robert Lee Jackson, 38, from Laurel County, married with 5 kids. All of them working class, all of them struggling, all doing whatever jobs kept their families fed and housed. None had any particular hatred for the environment or mountain families. They were just men trying to survive in an economy that had abandoned them. Catco paid $15 an hour, which was good money, in 1983 Kentucky. The work was dangerous, exhausting, loud, destructive, but it was work. The crew operated with industrial efficiency. They'd arrive at sites before dawn, work until dusk, clear cutting acres of old-growth forest in days. Chainsaws, skidders, log trucks. Trees that had taken 200 years to grow came down in minutes. The wood was valuable. White oak brought premium prices. The crew worked on commission, so speed mattered. The faster they cleared a site, the more money everyone made. They knew, vaguely, that some landowners opposed the logging. They knew Catco's contracts were sometimes questionable, that the company exploited desperate people, that environmental damage was severe. But in 1983, Eastern Kentucky, with unemployment around 40%, Moral qualms were luxuries most men couldn't afford. You fed your family, you kept your job, you didn't think too hard about consequences. Bobby Ray's crew had been working in Breathitt County since late September. They'd already cleared 3 sites, thousands of trees, hundreds of thousands of board feet. The work was routine. Show up, cut, load, move on. Just another job. None of them knew what they were about to trigger. October 19th, 1983. Started like any morning on the Garrett homestead. Raymond woke at 4:45, made his coffee, read his chapter from Kings, smoked his cigarette, walked to the white oak. The sun was just coloring the eastern sky when he reached the ridge. The oak stood silhouetted against dawn, massive and eternal, its branches spreading wide like arms embracing the valley below. Raymond stood there for 20 minutes, as he did every morning, being present with the tree, with his ancestors, with the continuity that defined his life. He traced the carved initials with his fingers, felt the rough bark, placed his palm against the trunk, and felt, or imagined he felt, something alive beyond mere botany. Then he heard it. The distant sound of diesel engines grinding up the mountain road. Too early for the school bus. Too heavy for anyone's personal truck. The sound got louder, closer, and Raymond felt something cold settle in his chest. He walked quickly back toward the house, his limp more pronounced in the morning chill, and by the time he reached the front porch, he could see them. 3 logging trucks, 1 skidder, and a Ford pickup leading the convoy, all turning onto his property access road. Catco logos on the truck doors. Raymond called for Michael and Jacob. Both sons emerged from their respective dwellings, alert to the urgency in their father's voice. By the time the trucks reached the clearing near the house, all 3 Garrett men were standing in the driveway. Bobby Ray Collins stepped out of the lead pickup, clipboard in hand, trying to project confidence he didn't quite feel. He introduced himself, explained that Catco had secured timber rights to the Garrett property, showed Raymond what appeared to be legal documents. Raymond took the papers, looked at them, looked at Bobby Ray, and said 2 words: "Get out." Bobby Ray tried to explain. The contract was legal, signed by Howard Messer, Breathitt County Clerk, who had authority to execute timber contracts on properties with unclear title. The Garrett land had been flagged as unclear title due to some technicality in the original 1840 claim. It was complicated, Bobby explained, but legal. The company had the right to harvest. Raymond didn't argue. He just repeated himself. "Get out. Now." Bobby Ray glanced at his crew, all of whom had climbed out of the trucks and were standing around looking uncomfortable. This wasn't the first time they'd encountered resistance, but something about Raymond Garrett's absolute certainty made this feel different. Bobby tried one more time. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but we've got a job to do and legal authority to do it. We're going to start cutting today. If you've got a problem with the contract, you need to take it up with the county clerk and with Catco's legal department, but we're cutting." Raymond looked at his sons. Both had gone very still, their faces expressionless, in that way that meant they were calculating, preparing. Then Raymond looked back at Bobby Ray and spoke quietly, clearly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. You cut one tree on this property, especially that oak, and there will be consequences. Not legal consequences, real consequences. You understand me?" Bobby Ray understood. He just didn't believe it. He'd heard threats before from angry landowners. They were always empty. People yelled, people fumed. But in the end, the law was law, and the work got done. October 20th, 1983, dawned clear and cold, temperature at 38 degrees, frost coating the grass in the valley. Bobby Ray Collins and his crew arrived at the Garrett property at 6:30 in the morning, earlier than usual, wanting to get started before Raymond could organize any legal resistance. They brought a Breathitt County deputy sheriff with them, a young man named Travis Combs, who looked uncomfortable with the whole situation, but who had been told by the county clerk that the logging was legal and that his job was to prevent interference. Raymond, Michael, and Jacob were already waiting on the ridge, where the white oak stood. Raymond wasn't armed, but both his sons were, rifles slung over their shoulders, not pointing at anyone, not threatening, just present. Deputy Combs approached first, tried to explain the situation. The county had reviewed the title issue. The original land claim from 1840 had never been properly registered with the state. That made the property technically public land, which gave the county authority to contract for timber rights. It was complicated, probably wrong, but technically legal, according to the county attorney. Raymond listened without interrupting, then asked one question. Did Howard Messer get paid by Catco for this determination? Combs didn't answer, which was answer enough. Messer had been bribed. Not obviously, probably through some contractor he hired or some campaign contribution, but the decision had been bought. The law wasn't protecting the Garretts. It was enabling their exploitation. Raymond told Combs he wasn't going to interfere with the deputy doing his job, but he wasn't leaving either. He was going to stand right there, next to his oak, and watch. If they wanted to cut it, they'd have to cut it with him watching. Combs looked at Bobby Ray, who shrugged. The crew could work around the old man. They had other trees to cut first anyway. For 3 hours, the Garretts stood on the ridge while Bobby Ray's crew worked the lower timber. The sound of chainsaws echoed across the valley, punctuated by the crash of falling trees. Each falling tree felt like a body blow to Raymond. These were trees his great-grandfather had known, trees that had been here when his grandfather was born. But he stood silent, witnessing, forcing himself to watch the destruction. Around 10 in the morning, Bobby Ray approached the ridge. They'd cleared enough of the lower timber. Time to take down the big oak. Too much value to leave it standing. He'd brought his best saw operator, Danny Higgins, who was experienced with big trees. Raymond stepped directly in front of the oak, arms spread wide, his back against the trunk. "You'll have to go through me first." Bobby Ray sighed. He turned to Deputy Combs. "You gonna do your job or not?" Combs walked up to Raymond, spoke softly. "Mr. Garrett, I don't want to arrest you, but I will if I have to. You're interfering with legal work. Please step aside." Raymond didn't move. Michael and Jacob shifted their rifles, not aiming, not threatening. But the intent was clear. Combs radioed for backup. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Dale Perkins arrived, a man in his early 60s who'd known Raymond for 30 years. Sheriff Dale Perkins was 62 years old that October, a man who'd worn the badge in Breathitt County for 34 years. He'd known Raymond Garrett since Raymond was a boy, had gone to school with Raymond's father, had attended Raymond's wedding to Sarah Louise. He was a decent man caught in an impossible situation. The law, as written, said Catco had the right to harvest. The county attorney had signed off. The paperwork looked legitimate, even if everyone suspected Howard Messer had been bribed. But suspicion wasn't proof, and Dale's job was enforcing the law as it existed, not as he wished it existed. He approached Raymond slowly, hands visible, voice calm. "Raymond, I know what this tree means to you. I know what your family's been through. But the law says they can cut it. I can't change that. If you don't step aside, I have to arrest you for interference. That's the law." Raymond looked at Dale, tears running down his weathered face, and said something that would haunt Dale for the rest of his life. "Then the law is wrong. And when the law is wrong, what's a man supposed to do?" Dale had no answer. He gave Raymond one more chance to step aside. When Raymond refused, Dale nodded to Deputy Combs. They arrested Raymond Garrett while his sons watched, their rifles still slung over their shoulders, their faces absolutely empty. Michael and Jacob didn't resist. They didn't interfere. They just watched as their father was handcuffed and led to the patrol car. Before Dale put Raymond in the vehicle, Raymond turned to look at Bobby Ray Collins and his crew. "What you're about to do is murder. You're killing something that's been alive for 347 years. Something that witnessed 7 generations of my family. You're doing it for money, for board feet, for profit. That makes you murderers. And murderers face consequences." Dale drove Raymond to the county jail in Jackson, booked him on charges of interference with legal commerce, set bail at $500. Sarah Louise posted bail within 2 hours using money they'd saved for winter heating oil. By the time Raymond got back to the homestead at 2 in the afternoon, it was done. The white oak was gone, cut into sections, loaded onto trucks, hauled away to be milled into flooring or furniture or whatever commodity someone would pay for. 347 years reduced to board feet in less than an hour. The stump remained 46 inches across, showing the growth rings like a history book no one would ever read. Raymond stood on the ridge looking at that stump for a long time. Michael and Jacob stood with him, the 3 men silent as the autumn sun dropped toward the western ridges. Finally, Raymond spoke. "They murdered our soul." That night, October 20th, 1983, the 3 Garrett men sat at the kitchen table. Raymond's Winchester Model 70 from Korea, Michael's Remington 700 from Vietnam, Jacob's Browning bar. They cleaned the rifles methodically, loaded magazines, didn't talk about what they were planning because they all already knew. October 21st, 1983, the day after the oak fell. Raymond Garrett didn't sleep. He sat in his kitchen from midnight until dawn, smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee, staring at a photograph on the wall. 7 generations of Garrett men standing in front of the white oak in 1976. His great-grandfather barely visible in a wheelchair. His grandfather, his father, Raymond himself, Michael, Jacob. 7 generations connected by a tree that no longer existed. At 5 in the morning, Michael and Jacob joined him without being called. They knew. Sarah Louise made breakfast, eggs and bacon and biscuits, the kind of meal you make when you know it might be the last normal thing. Nobody talked about what was coming. They talked about tobacco prices, about whether the truck needed new brakes, about nothing that mattered. After breakfast, Raymond spread a topographical map of Breathitt County across the table. Catco's logging operation was based out of a staging area on Route 476, about 8 miles from the homestead. Bobby Ray's crew arrived there every morning at 6:15, loaded equipment, drove to whatever site they were working. The crew worked in pairs. They took lunch around noon. They finished work around 4:30, drove back to the staging area, went home. 10 men total. Raymond had their routine memorized from watching them work his property. The plan formed slowly over 3 hours of quiet discussion. Not some brilliant tactical operation. Just 3 men who knew the mountains, who knew how to hunt, applying those skills to hunting men. They couldn't attack at the staging area, too visible, too close to the main road. They couldn't attack while the crew was working, too spread out, too much heavy equipment. The vulnerable moment was the drive. The logging trucks traveled on isolated mountain roads, narrow 2 lanes with steep drop-offs, curves so tight you couldn't see around them. Perfect ambush terrain. Raymond traced the route on the map. Route 476 to Frozen Creek Road, to whatever site they were working. 3 miles of road that saw maybe 5 vehicles an hour. Dense forest on both sides, elevation changes creating blind spots. If you knew the terrain, if you positioned yourself right, you could stop a convoy and eliminate everyone before anyone could react or escape. Michael asked the question none of them wanted to acknowledge. How many? Raymond's answer was quiet and absolute. All of them. Every man who touched that tree. This wasn't about sending a message. This wasn't about revenge in the sense of evening a score. This was about making clear that some things were sacred. And violating the sacred had consequences that law couldn't prevent and mercy couldn't soften. They spent the afternoon preparing, cleaned the rifles, loaded magazines, selected ammunition. Raymond's Winchester took .30-06, good to 600 yards. Michael's Remington took .308, deadly accurate to 800. Jacob's Browning Bar took .30-06, semi-automatic, 15 rounds. They loaded the rifles into Michael's truck, covered them with a tarp. They packed water, sandwiches, coffee. This would take all day. Sarah Louise watched from the kitchen window. She didn't try to stop them. She didn't argue. She just watched. Her husband and sons were going to kill 10 men. Those 10 men had families too. But the oak was gone. 347 years murdered for profit. And in the mountains, some debts had to be paid in blood. October 23rd, 1983. 4:45 in the morning. Raymond, Michael, and Jacob left the homestead in Michael's truck, drove 8 miles to Turkeyfoot Hollow, a section of Frozen Creek Road, where the pavement narrowed to barely 1 lane and curved sharply around a limestone cliff face. They'd chosen this spot because it offered everything they needed. High ground on the south side, dense forest providing concealment, a curve that would force vehicles to slow to 15 miles per hour and only one direction of escape. If you hit the lead vehicle and the rear vehicle, everything in between was trapped. They positioned themselves 300 yards apart along the ridge. Raymond at the northern position with clear line of sight to the curve's entry point. Jacob in the middle. Michael at the southern position covering the exit. 300 yards between them meant they could cover 900 yards of road. The temperature was 36 degrees. Fog hung thick in the valley below. They could hear Frozen Creek running over rocks. At 600 hours, they heard the first diesel engine. The convoy appeared around the bend at 6:12. 3 logging trucks, the skidder on a flatbed trailer, Bobby Ray's pickup in front, a crew van bringing up the rear, 6 vehicles moving at maybe 20 miles per hour. Raymond sighted on Bobby Ray's pickup through his scope. He could see Bobby clearly, coffee cup in hand, probably thinking about his kids, probably not thinking about 347-year-old oak trees or mountain justice. Raymond fired at 6:13 and 17 seconds. The round punched through the windshield and took Bobby Ray Collins in the center of his chest. The truck veered left, hit the cliff face, stopped. Michael and Jacob opened fire. The rear crew van's windshield exploded. The driver, Kevin Walsh, dead before he could brake. Then it was chaos. Men scrambling out of vehicles, trying to understand what was happening, where the shots were coming from. Danny Higgins made it out of the first logging truck, started running. Michael tracked him, fired twice. Danny went down. Roy Thompson tried to take cover behind his truck's wheel. Raymond had angle on him from the high ground. One shot, Roy stopped moving. Marcus Webb and James Dale Porter were in the skidder truck. Marcus tried to start it. Jacob put 3 rounds through the cab. Both men died without getting the engine started. Carl Messer ran for the tree line. Open ground, no cover, 3 rifles tracking him. All 3 Garretts fired. Carl went down 20 yards from the road. Tyler Banks had been in the crew van. He survived the initial shots, climbed out, started running up the road, screaming. Michael let him get 50 yards, then fired once. Frank Morrison and Robert Lee Jackson were in the last logging truck. They stayed in the cab, hands visible, not moving. Raymond sighted on the cab, fired 4 rounds through the driver's side. 9 dead in 90 seconds. The only survivor was the passenger in Bobby Ray's truck, who stumbled out and started running. Michael had the shot. Clean, easy, 200 yards. He put the crosshairs on the running man's back, then lowered the rifle. Let him go. One witness to carry the story. The survivor, a 22-year-old equipment operator named Jesse Hartman, who'd been riding with Bobby Ray, made it to a farmhouse 3 miles from the ambush site by 7:15. He was in shock, couldn't form coherent sentences, kept saying they're all dead over and over. The farmer, Earl Gibson, called Breathitt County Sheriff's Office. Deputy Travis Combs responded, found Jesse sitting on Earl's porch, covered in Bobby Ray's blood, shaking so hard he couldn't light a cigarette. Combs got enough information to know something catastrophic had happened at Turkey Foot Hollow. He radioed for backup and ambulances, then drove to the site. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. 9 bodies, some still in vehicles, some on the pavement, one 50 yards up the road. Blood everywhere. Shattered glass. The smell of gunpowder and diesel and something else, something chemical, that Combs later realized was the smell of sudden, violent death. He radioed for Kentucky State Police, for the FBI, for anyone with authority to handle what he was looking at. This wasn't a crime scene. It was a battlefield. Sheriff Dale Perkins arrived at 7:45. He stood in the middle of the road, looking at the carnage, and he knew. Knew without investigation, knew without evidence. Knew in his bones who'd done this. He'd arrested Raymond Garrett 3 days ago. He'd watched Raymond's face when the oak fell. He'd heard Raymond's words to Bobby Ray. Murderers face consequences. Dale had thought it was just talk. He'd been wrong. Kentucky State Police arrived at 8:20. FBI Mobile Response Unit arrived at 9:15, helicopters circling, federal agents in tactical gear, treating this like a terrorist incident. The media showed up by 10, news trucks from Lexington and Louisville, reporters trying to get close enough for footage. Sheriff Perkins established a perimeter, but he couldn't stop the helicopters, couldn't prevent the cameras from capturing aerial views of logging trucks and bodies and a massacre scene that would be on national news by noon. The FBI special agent in charge was named Robert Hastings, 47 years old, based out of Louisville. He'd worked organized crime, drug cartels, domestic terrorism. He'd never worked anything like this. 9 men executed in an ambush. Military precision. 3 shooters he determined from the angles and calibers recovered. High-powered rifles. Someone who knew the terrain, knew the victim's route, knew exactly what they were doing. By noon, Hastings had enough information to form a theory. This wasn't random. This was targeted, specific, motivated by something personal. He talked to Sheriff Perkins, got the story about the White Oak, about Raymond Garrett's arrest, about the threats. Perkins gave it all up without hesitation. He liked Raymond, respected him. But 9 men were dead. That changed everything. Hastings got a warrant for the Garrett homestead by 1 in the afternoon, assembled a tactical team, figured there'd be resistance. The convoy of federal vehicles and state police cars rolled up to the Garrett property at 2:30. Hastings expected a standoff. What he found was Raymond, Michael, and Jacob sitting on the front porch, unarmed, waiting. Their rifles were propped against the porch railing, unloaded, laid out like an offering. Raymond stood when Hastings approached. His first words were, "We did it. We killed them all. And we'd do it again." FBI Special Agent Robert Hastings had prepared for a siege. Tactical teams, positioned in the tree line, snipers on the ridge, negotiators, ready to spend days talking the Garretts into surrender. Instead, he got 3 men who acted like they'd been waiting for him. Raymond Garrett walked down the porch steps with his hands visible. No weapon, no aggression. Michael and Jacob followed. Sarah Louise stayed in the doorway, watching with eyes that held something between grief and pride. Hastings read them their rights. Right to remain silent, right to an attorney. Anything they said could be used against them. Raymond listened politely, then asked if he could make a statement. Hastings cautioned him again. "You don't have to say anything." Raymond's response was simple. "I want to. I want everyone to know why." They sat at the kitchen table. the same table where they'd planned the ambush 2 days before. Hastings had a recording device. Raymond spoke for 40 minutes. He explained about the oak, 347 years old, planted by his great-great-great-great-grandfather, 7 generations born beneath it, 12 generations carving their initials, the physical manifestation of his family's soul, their connection to the past, their legacy to the future. He explained about Catco, the corrupt contract, the bribed county clerk, the law that protected corporations but not sacred things. He explained about standing in front of the tree, being arrested, coming home to find it murdered, cut into pieces, hauled away for profit. He explained about the code, mountain justice. When the law fails to protect what matters, when the system enables rather than prevents violation of the sacred, men have to protect their own. He explained that he knew it was murder, knew it was wrong by modern standards, by legal standards, by any civilized standard. But civilization hadn't protected his tree. The law hadn't protected his heritage. So he'd fallen back on older codes, codes that said, you defend what's yours, you punish those who harm it, you do it yourself because no one else will. Hastings listened without interrupting. When Raymond finished, Hastings asked one question. Do you regret it? Raymond thought for a long moment, then answered, I regret that it was necessary. I regret that 9 men had to die. I regret their families' loss. But I don't regret defending what was sacred to my family. If I had to do it again, knowing everything I know, I'd make the same choice. The arrests were processed by 4 in the afternoon. Raymond Dale Garrett, Michael Raymond Garrett, Jacob Thomas Garrett, all charged with 9 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, aggravated assault, and a dozen other federal and state charges. Bail was denied. Too dangerous, too much flight risk, too calculated. They were transferred to the federal holding facility in Lexington that evening. Sarah Louise watched them load her husband and sons into separate vehicles, watched the convoy drive away, and then she walked to the ridge where the oak stump remained. She sat there until dark. The media circus was immediate and overwhelming. By the next morning, the Sacred Oak Massacre was national news. CNN, ABC, NBC, every major network. Environmental groups calling the Garretts heroes. Law enforcement calling them cold-blooded killers. Rural communities split down the middle. The trial began on March 5, 1984, in federal court in Lexington, Kentucky. The prosecution was handled by Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Chen, 42 years old, known for methodical presentation and high conviction rates. Her case was straightforward. Premeditated murder. 3 men had planned an ambush, positioned themselves with military precision, executed 9 unarmed civilians. The motive didn't matter. Whether it was a tree or a car or a family dispute, murder was murder. The law was clear. The defense was handled by James Whitaker, a Lexington attorney who'd grown up in Harlan County and understood mountain culture. He knew he couldn't win on the facts. His clients had confessed. The evidence was overwhelming. His only hope was jury nullification, convincing 12 Kentuckians that sometimes the law is so unjust that breaking it is the only moral choice. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution called forensic experts who testified about bullet trajectories, shooting positions, the precision of the attack. They called Jesse Hartman, who described the ambush through tears, described watching Bobby Ray die, described running while his coworkers were murdered. They called the victims' families. Linda Collins, Bobby Ray's widow, testified about her husband coaching Little League, about their plans for their oldest son's college education, about the hole in her family that could never be filled. They called all 9 families, wives, children, parents, each one describing a man who'd been working a job, supporting a family, doing nothing that deserved death. The emotional weight was crushing. The defense called experts on Appalachian culture, historians who explained mountain justice codes that predated federal law. They called environmental scientists who testified about the ecological value of old-growth forests, about how 347-year-old trees were irreplaceable. They tried to call witnesses about Catco's corrupt practices, about Howard Messer's bribery, about the systematic exploitation of rural communities. The judge blocked most of it. The trial wasn't about Catco's business practices. It was about whether the Garretts had committed murder. Everything else was irrelevant. The most powerful testimony came from Raymond himself. Against his lawyer's advice, he insisted on taking the stand. He spent 2 days testifying, explained his family's history, explained what the oak meant, explained the code he'd been raised with, explained his decision to kill 9 men. He didn't minimize it, didn't make excuses, just explained. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The question wasn't whether the Garretts had killed 9 men. That was admitted. The question was degree. First-degree murder required premeditation and deliberation. Second degree was intentional killing without premeditation. The jury came back with a compromise verdict, guilty of second-degree murder on all 9 counts, not first degree. The jury had rejected the prosecution's argument that this was coldly calculated. They'd accepted that it was a response to extreme circumstances, to provocation that the law didn't recognize but that human beings understood. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Raymond received 25 years. Michael received 20 years. Jacob received 18 years. Raymond Dale Garrett entered federal prison at USP McCreary in Pine Knot, Kentucky on April 20th, 1984. He was 54 years old. The prison psychiatrist evaluated him in his first week, looking for signs of psychosis, sociopathy, the mental illness that might explain 9 murders. What he found instead was a man of absolute clarity. Raymond understood what he'd done, understood it was murder, understood the consequences, but he maintained consistent and unwavering that he'd had no choice. The psychiatrist wrote in his report that Raymond Garrett was the sanest mass murderer he'd ever evaluated. That was somehow more disturbing than madness would have been. Raymond adapted to prison the way he'd adapted to war, to poverty, to everything else. He kept his head down, did his work, didn't cause trouble. Other inmates mostly left him alone. Word got around about why he was there. Even in prison, there was respect for a man who'd killed to protect something sacred. He worked in the prison library, shelving books, helping other inmates with legal research. Sarah Louise visited every Sunday for the first 3 years. She'd drive the 120 miles from Breathitt County to Pine Knot, sit in the visiting room for 2 hours, talk about the weather, about neighbors, about everything except what mattered. They didn't talk about the oak, didn't talk about the 9 dead men, just talked around the hole in their lives until visiting hours ended. In 1987, Sarah Louise had a stroke. Not massive, but enough. Left side weakness, speech difficulties, couldn't drive anymore. The Sunday visit stopped. Raymond got updates through letters from neighbors, but the connection frayed. In 1991, Raymond had a heart attack. Massive anterior wall infarction. He survived, but barely. The prison doctors told him his heart was damaged beyond repair. On August 14, 1992, Raymond Dale Garrett died in the prison infirmary at 2:30 in the morning. Heart failure. He was 62 years old, had served 8 years of his 25-year sentence. Sarah Louise buried him in the family cemetery 10 feet from where the white oak had stood, next to the stump that remained. Michael Raymond Garrett served his full 20-year sentence at FCI Manchester in Clay County, Kentucky. He was released on October 23, 2003, exactly 20 years after the massacre. He was 49 years old. Prison had been particularly hard on Michael. His PTSD from Vietnam, combined with the trauma of the killings, had broken something fundamental. He got a job as a night janitor at an office building in Lexington, worked alone cleaning empty offices. He never went back to Breathitt County. He lived in an efficiency apartment, worked his shifts, existed more than lived. In 2008, a social worker found him dead in his apartment. Heart attack. He was 54 years old. Jacob Thomas Garrett served his 18-year sentence at FCI Ashland in Boyd County, Kentucky. He was released on October 23, 2001. He was 45 years old. Of the 3 Garrett men, Jacob had seemed the most stable. But prison had taught him something terrible. He'd killed 3 men at Turkeyfoot Hollow. In prison, during the long nights, Jacob couldn't stop seeing their faces. Unlike Raymond, who maintained absolute certainty, and unlike Michael, whose trauma blurred everything, Jacob had clarity. And that clarity was unbearable. He was released on a Tuesday. On Friday, Sarah Louise found him in the barn. He'd hanged himself. His suicide note was one sentence: "I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to live with what we did." Sarah Louise Garrett lived alone on the family property from 2001 until her death in 2009. She was 77 years old when she died, cancer that had been eating her for months before she finally saw a doctor. She refused treatment, told the oncologist she was ready to join her husband and sons. She died on March 3, 2009. Before she died, she made arrangements. The property, all 240 acres, was donated to the Kentucky Nature Conservancy with one condition: the oak stump must be preserved. A marker must be placed explaining what had stood there, how long it had lived, what it had meant. She didn't want the massacre mentioned. Just the tree, just the history of 7 generations in 347 years. The Nature Conservancy accepted. They built a small pavilion around the stump, protected it from weather, placed a bronze plaque with the oak's history. It became a minor tourist attraction. People would hike the 2 miles from the parking area to see the stump, to read about the tree, to stand where something that old had witnessed that much history. Most visitors didn't know about the massacre, but locals knew. And sometimes, on Sunday afternoons, you'd see older people standing by the stump, not saying anything, just remembering. The 9 victims were buried in their home communities across eastern Kentucky: Bobby Ray Collins in Pineville, Danny Higgins in Harlan, Roy Thompson in Cumberland. Each man's grave marked with their name, dates, and usually the phrase, beloved husband, beloved father. Their families tried to move on. Linda Collins never remarried. She raised her 3 children alone on Social Security survivor benefits and her wages from the grocery store. Her oldest son became a lawyer, specialized in workers' rights. His mother told him once that his father would have been proud. The logging industry changed in Kentucky after the Sacred Oak Massacre. Not immediately, not dramatically, but changed. Companies became more careful about title disputes, about making sure landowners actually consented. Catco itself was investigated by federal authorities. Howard Messer, the Breathitt County clerk who'd approved the fraudulent timber contract, was indicted for bribery and corruption. He pleaded guilty, served 3 years in federal prison, came out a broken man. Dale Pritchard, the Catco land agent who'd tried to buy the Garrett timber rights, quit the company in 1985. He told a reporter years later that he couldn't do the job anymore, couldn't look at old growth forests and see dollar signs instead of history. He became a high school teacher in Harlan County, taught biology and environmental science. Consolidated Appalachian Timber Corporation, restructured in 1990, was absorbed by a larger conglomerate, eventually ceased to exist as a distinct entity. The name faded, but the practice didn't. Logging continued in Appalachia, still continues, driven by the same economic pressures. Trees still fall for profit. Communities still struggle with the choice between heritage and survival. The fundamental conflict hasn't been resolved. Jesse Hartman, the lone survivor of the massacre, struggled for years. He had PTSD, couldn't hold jobs, couldn't escape the memory of that morning. In 1990, he moved to Florida, tried to start over somewhere without mountains. He eventually became a substance abuse counselor. He told a podcast interviewer in 2015 that surviving when 9 others died had haunted him for 3 decades. The interviewer asked if he blamed the Garretts. Jesse thought for a long time. I blame the system that put us all in that position. They were defending something sacred. We were just trying to feed our families. Catco was exploiting everyone. Nobody won, everybody lost. 41 years have passed since that October morning in Turkey Foot Hollow. The physical evidence has mostly disappeared. The ambush site looks like any other mountain curve now. No marker, no memorial, nothing to indicate that 9 men died there. The road was repaved twice. The forest has grown back. If you didn't know what happened there, you'd drive past without a second thought. The Garrett homestead still stands, maintained now by the Nature Conservancy as part of the preserve. The house is open for tours on weekends. Thousands of people visit each year. They see the simple furniture, the photographs on the walls, the Bible. Raymond read every morning. The tour guides explain the history carefully, factually, without judgment. This was a family that valued heritage above all else. When that heritage was threatened, they responded with violence. 9 men died. 3 men went to prison. Everyone involved paid a price no one should have to pay. The white oak stump remains the centerpiece. 41 years of weather have worn it down some, but the growth rings are still visible. 347 concentric circles, each one representing a year. Visitors count them, trying to comprehend that kind of time span. The stump is 46 inches across. Children climb on it while their parents take pictures. None of them know that men died because this tree fell. The preservation has worked. The 240 acres have remained undeveloped, protected in perpetuity. The forest is growing back, mostly oak and hickory. In 100 years, maybe 200, the forest might look like it did before Catco came. That was Sarah Louise's final gift. The story of the Sacred Oak Massacre has become legend in Appalachia. Different versions circulate, each one emphasizing different aspects. Environmental groups tell it as a story about corporate greed destroying irreplaceable nature. Conservative mountain communities tell it as a story about defending property from government overreach. Legal scholars use it as a case study in jury nullification. Everyone finds something different in the story. That's because the story resists simple interpretation. Was Raymond Garrett a hero who defended the sacred? Was he a murderer who killed 9 innocent working men over a tree? Both things are true. That's the uncomfortable reality. He defended something genuinely sacred, irreplaceable, profoundly meaningful. And he murdered 9 men who were just trying to feed their families. The 9 dead loggers weren't villains. They were Bobby Ray Collins coaching Little League, Danny Higgins saving for his daughter's wedding, Roy Thompson sending money to his disabled mother. But Raymond wasn't simply a monster either. He was a man promised that law would protect his rights. When those institutions failed, when the law enabled his exploitation, he fell back on older codes that said you protect your own, that some things are worth dying for. Raymond Garrett's answer was violence. 9 men dead. That answer was wrong. But the question remains, what do you do when the system fails to protect what matters most? When everything you value can be legally destroyed? There's no good answer. If this story made you think about justice and heritage and the price we pay when systems fail, share it. Comment below. What would you have done? Where do you draw the line between defending what's sacred and becoming a murderer? Until next time, remember that monsters aren't always born. Sometimes they're made. One corrupted contract, one sacred tree, one terrible choice at a time.